Does your attempt at squatting deep currently look like this? Or maybe this? Or wide and turned out like this? Or just pathetic like this? Yeah, I know what it's like. It used to be me. By the end of this video, your squat will be looking like this. Well, maybe not, but it'll definitely be feeling more comfortable and you will be able to access more range of motion. The biggest issue I ran into years ago when I was trying to research how to develop a deeper squat, especially for a naturally stiff person who's never had the ability to deep squat, I don't even have a single baby picture of me sitting in a deep squat. And I would come across on YouTube just tutorials and routines of people that have a deep squat, but their routines already required the ability to sit in a deep squat. You needed this prerequisite ability. Yet, what about the people who can't squat, who can't get below parallel before they just fall back on their butt? Unfortunately, I just couldn't find the answers I needed. But it turns out that the squat itself is more of an expression of flexibility. And what I mean by that is that it's such a multi-joint position that requires flexibility in the ankles, knees, hips, and spine that the squat itself isn't the best way to develop the deeper squat. It's more effective to find what your main limitation is in the squat, really train that isolated joint with intensity and intent, and then integrate it back into the squat later on. Now, ankle mobility tends to be overrated when it comes to developing a deep squat. There's only so far you can get with your ankles. I had way more success with improving my hip mobility, especially my ability to flex the hip. So you can see from the side, my knee starts going forward as I descend into the squat, but after I reach about parallel, what needs to happen is the hip needs to flex more. So if you can get to around parallel, then I would say you probably have good enough mobility to squat deep in your ankles. Maybe the biggest priority should be your hip flexion. Now, the femur is supposed to be able to flex to about 120 degrees. We lay on the back, we should be able to get the knee toward the chest at about 120 degrees. Anything past that, it's probably just coming from the pelvis. Now, a lot of times, people will get stuck at around 90, and then they will abduct at the hip to free up a little bit more motion. And this is fine, especially in the context of a squat, because most people are going to be abducted and externally rotated. And if you have maybe some labral tear or FAI, then this might be the strategy you're going to have to use to get into a deeper squat. That being said, you can improve this hip flexion ability quite a bit. So in order to improve hip flexion, we need to improve the flexibility of the hip extensor muscles. So in particular, the hip rotators, the glutes, and the proximal hamstrings, as well as some components of the adductors. And we also need to strengthen the muscles on the front of the hip flexors, to pull us into more hip flexion. A lot of times people are limited in their ability to squat deep because they can't counterbalance themselves. Babies have such an easy time squatting deep because their big head counterbalances them forward. We need to be able to pull deeper with our hip flexors, actively pulling our knees toward our chest to sink into this bottom position. So the hip flexors not only need to be strong, they need to be strong in their shortened ranges. Not only do the glute max, the glute med, the glute min need to be able to lengthen, but also the hip rotators. So if you're struggling with hip flexion, we may need to look at hip internal rotation, and I'm going to show you a great internal rotation stretch that I haven't talked about too much before, but it'll feel really good and it'll improve your ability to flex the hip. So let's get into it. Okay, the first exercise is going to be the quadruped glute stretch. This is also going to be stretching aspects of the hip capsule as well. So this is really going to improve hip flexion very quickly. So we're going to start taking a yoga block. I'm going to be working my left side in this example. So I'm going to place my stretching side knee on that yoga block, and I'm going to extend the back leg to facilitate more of this anterior pelvic tilt. Now from here, I want to start with my knee directly under the hip, and then tilt my pelvis forward and slightly shift my center of mass over toward this left side without rotating the belly button away. Okay, we don't want to wag the pelvis. We want a direct translation. You can also add a little bit of external rotation here at the femur to get a bit more length into the muscles in the lateral hip here. So from here, I want to drop the opposite side pelvis so that my belly button is now facing the stretching side knee. So in this case, I'm turning my belly button to the left without my pelvis translating the opposite way. So it's very important we keep a square hip in this position. Now from here, I'm going to just sit back into more hip flexion. Now we get into the contractions. So I'm going to actively drive my knee down and back through the block. About 10 seconds here. Relax. Now I can either go deeper into the stretch via hip flexion. I can hinge a little bit more, so tilting my pelvis forward and keeping my femur in the exact same position. Or I can rotate my belly button more toward this knee. So I am improving flexibility through the transverse plane in rotation here. So there's many different ways we can go about this. So contract, relax. I can actively rotate more. I can sink back into more hip flexion, or I can just hinge my torso more toward the floor. Now, if you're already very restricted in your hip flexion, then I actually prefer to use an elevated surface for the hands. Now, this allows us to keep a much more upright torso, and it brings our starting point outside of our end range hip flexion so we can actively sink into it and not compensate at the pelvis at all. So even for myself, I really like this variation. So we can crush the knee into the foam block while attempting to get light on our hands as if we're trying to balance ourselves with the strength of our glutes. Inhale. Relax, sink deeper into flexion. I can even pull this side of the pelvis down, facing the belly button toward the knee. So we can perform this for about 3 to 5 cycles, 5 to 10 second contractions, going deeper each time, and then we can perform this for multiple sets. Now, if you're doing this drill and you get a little bit of a pinch in the hip, then that might mean you need to work on that hip internal rotation directly. So this next drill is going to cover that. This is the banded 90-90 internal rotation stretch. So I'm going to take my foot, loop it through the band, and place the band around my knee joint. Now from here, I'm going to get into this 90-90 stretch and get a lot of tension on this band. I'm using a very thick band here. Okay, so this band is pulling my femur into more abduction, and it's giving this traction force through the hip capsule. So already in this position, I feel a really nice stretch through internal rotation, and it's less pinchy too because of that traction force. Now from here, I don't want to treat this as a 90-90 on both legs. I want to really prioritize 90 degrees on the back leg. So I'm going to take this leg, pull it in. I can even let this knee come up, and this gives me more leverage to pull into internal rotation on this side. The key is trying to get the butt cheek toward the ground and face the torso toward this foot. Okay, so now the contraction here, the first contraction is going to be trying to drive the foot into the ground. So I'm going to push 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Relax. I could try to rotate a little bit further. The second contraction is going to be try to pull the band. So I'm trying to pull that band back, increase the tension in the band. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I should feel some cramping through my internal rotators. Then relax, let that band pull me out even more as I turn into the stretch. And then the last contraction, actively try to lift the foot up off the ground. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Relax. So we can perform these contractions for another cycle, maybe 2 to 3 times staying in the stretch. So you might be in this position for around 60 to 90 seconds and then come on out of it. What we can also do in this position is perform some dynamic actions against this band resistance. So I'm going to get all the way out, and I'm just going to let the band pull me out and then pull on the band. So pull out and then move against this band tension, all while keeping my torso turned toward this foot. So we can perform this drill statically for some contract-relax cycles, or we can move dynamically through the position for reps, or we can combine them, do some dynamic reps and then some contract-relax cycles at the end. So a lot of options with this one, but always test and retest. We should notice great improvements of internal rotation afterwards and less pain and restriction with hip flexion. Okay, now let's go over some hip flexor strengthening. And we're going to do so in ways that are very specific to the squat. So as you can see, I'm in a position where it mimics my deep squat. So we want to perform this drill at the limit of your personal deep squat. So this is going to be different for everyone. You want to set up at a point where you can keep your low back flat and anteriorly tilted, and we could still get a little bit of a lift off. I'm going to take a yoga block and give myself something to squeeze. So I'm going to apply pressure through my hand into the box and then actively try to crush the block. So I'm trying to pull my knee up into the block and pull my torso down into the block. So I'm going to perform that 5 to 10 seconds. I can move the block further out. We should really feel these hip flexors fired up. And then from there, we're going to lift off. Okay, I can lean a little bit more forward. I can turn away. I can turn toward. And we want to try to get as upright as possible when we're performing this. And we want to make sure we are barely getting the foot off the ground. My hip is already cramping. This is a very difficult exercise, more difficult than it looks. So we could play around with the rotation at our torso. So if I turn away, I'm going to emphasize more contraction through the lateral hip and TFL. As we move into external rotation, as I turn toward, I can bias some more of the internally rotating fibers that also flex the hip. So rotate, lift, and then the more we tilt our pelvis forward, tilt our torso forward, this brings us into more relative hip flexion and it makes the drill harder. As a progression, we can have objects on the side and we can do this without butt support. Get into our deep squat, torso upright, and lift. We could do this alternating or just do one side at a time. A little bit of extra spice, I can lift and extend and back in without losing height. Lift, extend, back in. But my squat feels really good after doing this, and the joint feels nice and centrated and not very pinchy. So with these, we don't want to perform a lot of repetitions. We want to have a lot of intent with this and provide a lot of intensity. So anywhere from 5 to 8 repetitions with a 3-second hold, and with the box supported drill, performing some overcoming isometrics first. If we're performing the last variation here, then maybe we're going to do a 2-second hold into hip flexion, slow extension, hold 2 seconds, and then maybe 3 to 5 seconds back in. As another challenge, we're going to do this bent knee squat hover. So have a very low support, something that it's very difficult to get the feet off the ground. Get into your squat, sink the butt down, and then hover the feet off the ground. Again, you could do this for repetitions, 3 to 5 seconds. Or you could just do a static hold anywhere from 15 to 30 seconds. Hey guys, that was the video. I hope you enjoyed this. Hopefully you took some exercises away that you haven't seen before, and give them a try and retest your squat afterwards. If this was a lot to digest, don't worry. In the next few seconds, I'm going to have the program all written out for you on what you should do, how you can integrate this into your mobility session, how often to do it, how many sets and reps. Okay, here's the program all laid out for you. I want you to perform this twice a week with 3 to 4 days of rest in between. So unlike most other squat protocols that have you doing this stuff all day, every day, I want you to train this intensely and recover in between. And don't think about it the rest of the week. Starting off with the quadruped glute stretch by itself, we're doing 2 to 3 sets of it with 3 contract relax cycles, driving the knee down and back into the ground. Now, if you feel uncomfortable in the hip or it's a bit pinchy, don't worry, it should feel better after each set. So after those sets, we're going to go into a superset, 2 to 3 rounds between the banded 90-90 internal rotation and the hip flexion liftoff. So one set is 2 full cycles of the contractions, all 3 of them that we went over in the tutorial video for the 90-90 internal rotation. And then after that, you're going to immediately go into the hip flexion liftoff. And for this, you're going to choose the variation suitable for your current level. And if you're watching this video and you really struggle with your deep squat, then you're probably going to want to stay at level 1, the box supported variation. And as you progress, you can move on to level 2 through 4. But with the liftoffs, quality is the name of the game. We want to focus the contraction to the hip flexors as much as possible and not compensate at the spine. So you'll perform these exercises back to back for 2 to 3 rounds. I just want to make a note that though we are looking at improving hip flexion directly with this video, what really helped me was taking a broader approach to my lower body flexibility, because muscles function in all 3 planes of motion. So just because I'm stretching my hip flexors or my adductors or my hamstrings doesn't mean we're just improving the opposite of their main motions. So I'm not just improving hip extension when I stretch the hip flexors. The hip flexors also have a rotational component at the hip joint. So do the adductors, especially the adductors. And loosening the adductors was really key in my journey to opening up my hips. The hamstrings, the glutes, all the muscles that connect around the hips, and open all of them just to feed some slack into the joint. Now, if you want a full comprehensive approach to improving all aspects of your hip mobility, check out my Supple Hips program. You can also download a free checklist that goes over everything you need to know about how to develop a deep squat. So if you found this video helpful, please share it to people that you think might benefit from it. And like the video, subscribe to the channel. I'm going to be putting out a ton more free, usable, practical content for you guys. And if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. Thanks for watching, guys. Peace.